First of all, thank you all for joining us today in our February webinar. For those of you who have been on these in the past, you'll notice a slightly different coloring to this first page and a little bit of new branding. So Verve in November was acquired and merged into Rockwell Automation. So we're now Verve, a Rockwell Automation company, and we're blending the red Rockwell with the orange Verve on it. So we're going to talk today about how to deliver this measurable, rapid OT security improvement and how Verve and Rockwell are coming together to do that with our clients. This is sort of the first time we've jointly come together to offer one of these webinars. So we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges that we're seeing out there in the marketplace that clients are undergoing in the OT security space. We're going to talk a little bit about a case study and some of the things we've learned about how to make this journey successful. And then lastly, we're going to close with a discussion of how Rockwell and Verve are coming together to really help bring a comprehensive solution to accelerate the security, which is absolutely critical in the world today. And as you'll notice, I have a partner in crime today, which is great. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm John Livingston. I'm the CEO of Verve, a Rockwell Automation company. I've been with Verve almost 8 years now, 7.5 years. Prior to that, I spent about 20 years, a little over 20 years with McKinsey & Company, which is a consulting firm, helping clients go through these digital transformation journeys, a lot around IoT or IIoT type of initiatives. And really now excited to be part of the Rockwell family. And today I have with me Shannon McKay, one of my new colleagues, and I'll let Shannon introduce himself.
Thank you, John. I'm really thrilled to be here. So again, my name's Shannon McKay. I'm a director within Lifecycle within Rockwell Automation. About 28 years actually coming up in terms of my tenure with the company. Kind of hard to believe, but I've spent the last 6 years or so focused in this lifecycle space. Maybe just to share a bit more on what Lifecycle is within Rockwell. We have 3 business segments at the corporate level. Lifecycle is made up of all the services and solutions offering. So essentially anything that does not come in a box, if you will, or can't be shipped on a crate, largely comes through our Lifecycle Services organization, and that's inclusive of the entire cybersecurity portfolio, for which Verve is now the key part of. So glad to be here.
Thank you, Shannon, and great to have you with us today to talk a little bit about the challenges that our customers are facing and how Verve and Rockwell are coming together. For those of you who don't know Verve, just by way of background, so Verve is a 31-year-old company. We are still an entity within Rockwell, so the company is a standalone business within the Rockwell portfolio. We're obviously coordinating and working closely together with our colleagues, but we are really trying to drive that cybersecurity component. We started originally as a systems integrator in the OT space, so we really come out of that deep knowledge of OT systems. And then about 15 years ago, we built what we now call the Verve Security Center, the first version of that, which is essentially applying IT-like security in OT environments. And then, as I mentioned, we combined with Rockwell last November. So as I mentioned earlier, 3 broad topics today. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges that we've seen in these OT security journeys. And the reason we're going to start with that is it really forms the foundation of how we're thinking about bringing the capabilities that Rockwell has along with the Verve capabilities together to help address those challenges. The second topic then will be a bit of a case study of how have we seen successful companies address the complexity of the risks that is OT security, and developing kind of a programmatic approach to it. And then lastly, we're going to spend our time talking a little bit about how Rockwell and Verve together can help organizations. So right after we came together, we participated in Rockwell's Automation Fair, and there was just a lot of discussion or questions around, well, how do the 2 pieces fit, and how can Rockwell and Verve help us accelerate? And so we're going to kind of deep dive into that a little bit more today. So that's the agenda. So for those of you who may be on the call who are more familiar with Rockwell, we did want to spend just a few minutes to talk a little bit more about Verve so that you have some introduction to it. So as I mentioned, the company was founded about 31 years ago as an automation engineering firm. So that kind of bottom right-hand side of the graphic here. It was vendor agnostic though. So from day one, our teams were working on designing and implementing control systems across Rockwell, Emerson, and GE, and Honeywell, and Yokogawa, and Siemens, et cetera. And so that, I'll call it heritage or legacy, really was the foundation upon which our software platform was built. Really, it was built because a number of customers in the power sector were going through the NERC CIP regulatory environment or requirements back in 2007 or so got started. And so they asked the company at the time to help develop software to enable them to manage the security in their OT environments. And what the Verve Security Center is, which is that top of the wheel over there on the right-hand side, really was how do we apply IT-like security into that OT environment, but really with a very, very deep understanding of all of the different control systems. So it would be safe and effective in an OT environment without causing any disruptions to what is most critical, which is the reliability of the systems. And then lastly, because of this challenge of resourcing and our heritage and legacy as a services provider, we always remain true to bringing a complete solution to the client, meaning not just dropping in a piece of software, but bringing along the services capability to help our clients both use the software, to deploy the software, use the software, and then really take that next step to what are the insights that are coming out of it, and how do I actually achieve an improved security system. And so these three pieces really fit together, and they are reinforcing of one another within the Verve environment. And so we're just thrilled to bring that into the Rockwell family. So from there, I'm going to hand over to Shannon to talk a little bit about these challenges that both we on the Verve side and Rockwell have been seeing around industrial cybersecurity and the challenges that our clients are facing.
Yeah, thank you, John. And as John did mention, the heritage of Verve, 30 plus years of automation and OT experience really has helped us identify what are the biggest challenges. So when we talk about the biggest challenges you face, it's not just in cyber, but across the manufacturing environment, but it's especially prevalent. It's very prevalent in cyber is the resourcing, right? So regardless of the best technology, best software platform or tool, you need to have subject matter expertise in this area, specifically around OT cyber. So that's a pervasive kind of pretty comprehensive problem that everybody faces. Asset inventory, which John will share a bit more on the actual platform and what it does, but this is really the core of it. I mean, understanding what is on your floor as deeply as you can go across your OT assets, up through your switching assets and your compute assets as well, is really a critical first step and a foundation. So we'll talk a lot about that today. But understanding all your assets is pretty significant as far as the challenge goes. Cyber is really complex. It requires a lot of different components, and to really solve the problem, there's not one software solution or tool that just fixes everything for you, just as in the IT world. An integrated platform is necessary to help bring all this together, which Verve can help support and drive. I mentioned IT. IT and OT are really critical here. The IT organization, the CISO organization really drives most of the activity around the OT cyber programs and needs. And so we need to work very closely with our IT counterparts to make sure we're meeting all the needs. And John will also talk a little bit about the OT security management platform and how that looks and was kind of modeled after traditional IT systems. Multi-vendor complexity is critical. Every end user has lots and lots of OEM control providers. So we'd love it if you had everything that said Allen Bradley on it, but we know that's not realistic. And so supporting third-party vendors across all the manufacturing environment is absolutely critical. And then lastly, I'll touch on it in a couple slides here on competing and overlapping frameworks. NIST is the most common framework we talk about in North America, but there's a variety of regulatory standards out there, depending upon the industry you serve, depending on the country you're in, and they're changing fast. So these are all significant challenges that we face. So on the next slide, I'll talk about really three kind of high-level phases to an OT cybersecurity program, depending on where you are in your cybersecurity maturity, if you will, or how long you've been involved in proactively trying to work on your cybersecurity strategy. There's really three broad phases. It starts with assessment, and we will talk about the platform itself and how it helps us identify and prioritize risk, but that's really the foundation. That's really the foundation of assessing where you are in terms of your current asset base. And then you need to develop a prioritized, based on scoring, an actionable roadmap of remediation, right? And then if we can remediate, early on, you can usually make a pretty significant step change in your security posture, especially early if this is sort of the first time you're activating some of this remediation. And then maintenance is really critical as well, right? So this cyber landscape changes very fast. And so ongoing maintenance and detection and continuing to support the program in a closed-loop fashion is critical as well. There's challenges across these three phases, right? And more than this, but here's some critical ones, right? When you talk about the assessment phase, it's really about getting deep, robust data sets from the assets. Like I said, OT assets like PLCs, switches, network assets, compute assets. But once you have all that data, it's really important to analyze it against known vulnerabilities and exploits. And then most importantly, prioritize them, right? With a scoring algorithm, John will speak to that and how Verve does it. And then remediation, there's a lot of things about the remediation piece of the phases that can be challenging in an operational environment. Namely, you don't want to shut down systems all the time to make patches, to upgrade firmwares, to modernize. So patching running systems and keeping the airplane flying while we're fixing it is a challenge for everybody. Different control and automation vendors have different approval processes when it comes to their own patches. And then firmware updates can be challenging as well, in particular, if you're talking about end-of-life assets or obsolete assets. It can be very difficult. And then finally, we always find, or often find, when we start to talk to our customers about their cybersecurity network, or the cybersecurity journey, is the network itself, are the bones that this thing is built on good and sound? Or do we need to take a step back and actually start with some network segmentation and network modernization first? And then finally, in monitor and maintain, I mentioned the personnel shortage that we all see with respect to knowledgeable, competent cybersecurity subject matter expertise. So that's a challenge. As I talked about, the ongoing updating of vulnerability data, given assessment challenges that we found, is pervasive. Alert overload is real, and John will talk a little bit about alert fatigue. It's great we get all this data. It's way better if we can understand how to prioritize and really focus in on the data that's actionable and the alerts that really require the most priority. And then operating environments across these distributed enterprises, increasingly connected across sites and across regions, but with increasing needs for cybersecurity practices makes it really difficult. The next slide, I'll talk a little bit about just high level, a little bit more on the concept of these regulations. So on the left, you can see lots of different representative standards and regulations. As I mentioned, there's a ton based on industry, based on geography. In North America, NIST CSF is a really solid framework that has been in place for some time and is pretty well adopted across industry. And you can see it starts with the identify phase. We talk about a 360-degree view of risk. So that's a result of looking at these assets in the inventory. And John will touch on that with a bit more detail as well as what that means. We talk about proactive endpoint and network protection. So here's where we get into endpoint being a focus of Verve's solution set. And then when you talk about network protection, for example, intrusion detection or continuous threat detection, we work with some of our partners to do some of that work. Telemetry around detection, data analysis from the asset side of it to new vulnerabilities and exploits, and taking all that telemetry and tying it together to turn it into an actionable reporting mechanism is really where Verve is extremely strong, but it's very complex. And then when we talk about respond and recover, right, we want to be able to respond to a threat, whether it's active or we think it's pending, while minimizing disruption where possible. So it's that balance between absolutely defending against threats in the cyberspace while keeping production running, which is critical to keep a product moving out the door. And then lastly, rapid and system recovery is critical. We work with, for example, Dragos as an incident response partner of ours. We talk a little bit later about technology partners. So this is a good way to look at the NIST framework. It's like I said, one of the most common. It's very common in North America, and we certainly subscribe to this when we talk about all these challenges in the marketplace.
Thanks, Shannon. Appreciate that. And I think just to summarize this, the point of that first section is we see these challenges, right? I mean, if you just take a look at that NIST framework, there's dozens of things you need to do as an organization, and that's just to achieve the NIST CSF. If I overlay the NIST 2, or if I overlay NERC CIP, et cetera, the challenges only increase from there. And so next, I just want to talk about, as we think about those challenges, how have we seen organizations address those problems? How have we seen them address some of the people problems? How have we seen them address, prioritizing the vulnerabilities? And then we'll talk, at the end about how we're bringing Verve and Rockwell together to help deliver on that. So as we get into the kind of the case study, typically what we have seen effective is to start, as Shannon laid out in that chart of the assess, remediate, maintain phases, to start with what we call a tech-enabled assessment. So as you begin a journey, and oftentimes we find that organizations might have jumped into the middle of a journey and said, okay, I'm going to go do network segmentation, or I'm going to go deploy threat detection. But they haven't sort of stepped back to say, all right, well, what am I really trying to accomplish with this? And where do I stand today, et cetera? So we find that the successful ones that kind of really bring a program to it start with some form of an assessment. And we like this tech-enabled assessment, which starts with aligning on that framework. So, the alphabet soup that we just talked about of all these different frameworks, right? What is your organization going to select? Are you going to use the NIST CSF? How much do you have to use NIST 2, et cetera? So the first is really, what are our objectives and what's our timing? Then doing some level of technical assessment of the sites. And we'll talk in more detail about how we use our Verve software to do this, because it allows you to get a very deep view technically of every asset in your environment and what the risks are. But even if you're not using Verve, we have seen the most successful organizations, as they get started, to have some form of technical assessment of their OT risks. And then third, really developing that prioritized roadmap. And we'll talk about how Verve can help do that, and frankly, even more so, how Verve and Rockwell together now can do that. But regardless of whether it's us or someone else, really getting clear around what exactly do I want to do and when, and how much impact is that action going to have? So is network segmentation critical to what I need to do? How important is patching those particular systems, et cetera? And so as we do that, those first three phases, we're also thinking about, how do you establish the governance? What are going to be, one of the most important ones is, okay, so I have a set of IT standards that I'm using. Well, where are the technical exceptions in that? It may be great to say you're gonna put antivirus on all your systems. Well, you're not going to put antivirus on a PLC, for instance. So how do you want to design a program where you can deal with some of those exceptions? And then obviously, as you move after this assessment phase, then moving into that remediate and then monitor and maintain phases. This is sort of what we've seen as an approach that works. Okay, so now we're stepping into that initial assessment. How do you do that? Well, our view is getting a very, very deep view of your assets is absolutely the sine qua non, the requirement of building an effective program. So we use this, sort of graphical idea of fishing. How deep are you seeing into the fish? How far down can you see? And so one of the reasons why we built Verve the way we did, which is a more active, direct outreach into these environments to find the assets, we're not reliant on that asset communicating through a switch or something like that to see it. We want to go out and find those assets, whether it's behind a backplane, behind some dual homed networking device or workstation, whatever, to be able to get down into that network deep, and also not just to see the asset, but to know everything there is to know about that asset, to know, is it been backed up lately, to know what are the users and accounts that are on it, how is it configured, because that view is going to give you that baseline of data that you really need to have to be able to do your risk assessment. So in our view, this is where you start. It's almost impossible to secure your environment. Even if you're going to go do a network segmentation, if you don't know what the assets are and how they're communicating and what needs to talk to what, it's really difficult to segment that effectively. We then, believe that the best way to build that roadmap is to do what we call a 360-degree risk analysis. And we'll walk through each of these pieces a little bit here in a second, but at a high level, having that inventory, hardware, software, et cetera, we can then immediately in an automated way, understand what are the vulnerabilities in that environment. What are the vulnerabilities on those assets? We can identify the patches that could possibly remediate those vulnerabilities. We can look at the insecure configs, right? So in an IT world, you might have a whole configuration management toolkit that you're using, through Active Directory or something like that, where you're setting group policies. But in many cases in OT, we don't do that for a variety of reasons that are unique to that environment. Well, we need to gather those configurations. We need to know that and identify where are our configurations insecure. Where do we have ports and services that we don't need? Where do we have, settings on the computer that might allow people to make changes that shouldn't be there? As simple as, screen times out, timeouts. Next, user and account risks. One of the big things we regularly see is users and accounts not being managed well in OT, in large part because there's no centralized domain to control that. And so one of the key things is to pull that data, pull all those user and account information back to add into our risk view. Anti-malware status, network protections. What's my network look like? What's my backup status, right? So if I do go down, if I do have an event, do I have a backup? Do I have an offline backup in case of ransomware that I can go back to? And then lastly, and this is critical to the whole story, is how important is the asset itself, right? I may know a lot of things about the risks in this diagram, but if I don't know how important the asset is, well, okay, maybe I don't care about that. Maybe it's redundant. So understanding that full 360 view allows us to prioritize, allows us to address those things that might be insecure by design. Hey, there's no CVE, there's no vulnerability, but it's just designed insecurely, and so I have to address that. So that's kind of our view. Okay, once you know what you have, how do you start to put a plan together? So to dive into each of those a little bit, CVEs or vulnerabilities, software and hardware vulnerabilities, look, they're an initial starting point. You can't do cybersecurity without having a good view of your vulnerabilities. But the reality is that many of these vulnerabilities may not be important to you. Or alternatively, they may be important, but there's no way you can address 20,000 vulnerabilities. And in most cases, when you begin a program, you are going to find you have 5, 10, 15, 20,000 vulnerabilities in there if you haven't been patching. And so this is one of our graphics from the Verve reporting module. And it's less to show you that, but more to just highlight, these are some of the things that you'll want to know. You'll want to know, okay, how many critical vulnerabilities? How many high vulnerabilities? What asset types are they on, which is the top of that chart? What is the impact of that vulnerability if it were exploited, right? Is it availability, meaning it could shut off access to the device? Is it integrity, meaning we may not be able to trust the data from that device? And then lastly, which are the assets that have the biggest risks? which are the ones that have the most vulnerabilities, or one could say the highest risk score by adding up the scores of vulnerabilities. So this is, it's a starting point. You can't really go anywhere without having some view of this. And one of the things that we use with our tech-enabled assessment, this is automatically generated through the software. But then it's not enough just to know that they exist. You want to start to prioritize them. So in a world where you've got 10, 15, 20, 30,000 vulnerabilities, how do you prioritize? Well, the first is, well, let's look at ones where there's an active exploit, meaning that somebody has actually taken advantage of that vulnerability in the wild, so to speak, and is actually using that to potentially compromise systems. Okay, so we certainly want to focus on those. We want to focus back to that critical asset point. Let's focus on the assets that really matter to our operation, because those are the ones where, we can have the biggest bang for our buck, so to speak. Shannon mentioned the challenges with resources. Well, we want to make sure we're focused on those vulnerabilities that are most critical, and those where there's no compensating control. So this is just the beginning of this notion of the 360 view, right? Bringing together different aspects of risk, not just vulnerability data, but criticality data, mitigating control data. So you're starting to see a more complete picture. Similarly, integrate those insecure configuration information. So, in the IT world, we have GPOs where we're setting them and we can check for compliance. Well, even without GPOs, we can use through the technology a way to see how good are we? Are we applying those secure standards in the OT environment or not? And if not, is there a reason for that? Or is it just that we're not managing them well? And then can we then apply and harden those configurations? And these are just some examples that you might see. I mentioned earlier the access control problems. One of the things we regularly see is after an outage, the service providers that are in there doing work, whether it be an OEM or a contractor, they'll create accounts for use in whether it be doing updating, tuning, whatever. Well, oftentimes we find that after the outage, no one then goes and removes those accounts. So you end up with these large number of inactive, frankly, admin accounts on the system. Or you might have a bunch of admin accounts where there are expired passwords and no one's bothered to change them. This is a huge risk in OT that, frankly, is something you can go after right away. I don't have to patch anything. I can go address these risks tomorrow through, cleaning up accounts, cleaning up password settings, et cetera. And then, as I mentioned on the networking side, some way of assessing what are my network risks, right? Do I have, basically remote access in a variety of different ways, no real separation within the OT environment, misconfigured networking devices or routing around networking devices through wireless or dual home networks, et cetera. So bringing that network picture into the discussion is also critical to doing the assessment. So at the end of that, what you're hopefully going to come up with is some form of a kind of defense in depth analysis. This is one framework. There's a lot of frameworks. You could use a NIST framework, et cetera. But this is one to lay out a simple way to say, what are the kinds of risks that we currently have in our environment, right? And layer those in. Okay, I have policy and procedure risk, meaning, I don't regularly follow a patch schedule, or I don't really have a backup policy. At the perimeter network, how secure is that network that is protecting the enterprise? And then at the ICS level or OT level, do I have good separation between the IT and the OT to protect it? We often find as we do this that, well, great, I got a firewall, but it turns out that I've got a bunch of systems, PLCs, et cetera, that are connecting over to IT that aren't going through the firewall, right? For a variety of reasons, they've been connected that way. Access control issues, as I mentioned, and then obviously the endpoint, patching, vulnerabilities, logging, et cetera. So what we've seen, those challenges that we talked about before, the path to success involves doing this 360 analysis and essentially building a really good view of what are our biggest risks that we have to address in the near term. So then what we want to bridge to now is, all right, so how and why are Verve and Rockwell coming together to make a difference here, right? So if we said those are the challenges, right? Labor challenges, resource challenges, asset inventory challenges, how to work between IT and OT, et cetera. And we've seen kind of the roadmap of success. All right, how can Rockwell and Verve help address those challenges? And so I'm going to hand back over to Shannon here for a little bit to talk a little bit about how Rockwell saw the combination of bringing Verve together with what Rockwell's been doing in cyber and OT for a long time. So Shannon?
Thank you. Thanks, John. Yeah, so John mentioned a little bit here. If you look at what each party brings here, and why I'll speak to a little bit why we believe this really is a 1 + 1 = 3 story. I mean, Verve has incredible experience. We talked about 30 years of vendor agnostic automation controls experience. They've got this proprietary asset inventory capability. They've got a global tech-enabled OT risk assessment capability. If you add that to the historical, 120-year-old Rockwell Automation offerings, going back to hardware and software provider, OT asset management in applications like FactoryTalk Asset Center, deep cyber experience with the acquisitions of Avnet and Oilo, and lots of experience around industrial networking, among other things. There's a natural complementary additive end outcome here as a result of the two parties coming together, and we're super excited about what it means. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the OT security management platform, and you can see this visual representation of gears, if you will, or a wheel. Think about it as a machine where asset inventory, we believe, is sort of at the center of this machine. It's the center cog. It's the biggest cog. We talked a little bit about two-way integration, making it seamlessly compatible with other systems and other portfolio offerings. We'll speak to that a little bit on the next slide as well. Complete visibility, gathering data points all the way down to the bottom of the ocean, as John called it, which really is 100% of the assets across the OT assets, networking assets, the OS or compute assets. Closed loop vulnerability management, taking remediating actions within the same platform. And again, this was built by industrial cybersecurity engineers with 30 years of OT experience. So we come from an OT background for an OT environment. And then lastly, operational continuity, security without disrupting the core operations. So those are sort of the key outcomes we're looking to drive by utilizing the security management platform. And I'll speak on the next slide a little bit more on why we think it's really a 1 + 1 = 3. So if you think about this machine, if you will, Rockwell Automation, of course, has had a long-standing history of technology partnerships. Verve has as well, and you can see some of them smattered across this screen here with respect to Clarity and Drago, ServiceNow, Veeam, Acronis, Fortinet, FactoryTalk Asset Center, of course, is Rockwell's platform, CrowdStrike. So we've had a long history together of partnering with world-class companies in many different areas across the cyber landscape, remote access to threat detection or intrusion detection tools to back and restore firewalls. And so when you think about all the OT needs in your plant across these varying application spaces, if you will, some of which we will provide with the sort of native RA solutions and some of which we will partner with longstanding technology partnerships. We really bring an a world-class industry leading solution set and portfolio now with Verve at the center of it. Now, finally, when you take all the different cyber OT subject matter expertise that we have built up, both organically as well as through acquisitions over the last 4 or 5 years, well over 300 subject matter experts in OT cybersecurity, and you apply those experts to this offering, really this breadth of offering, there's nobody better suited to solve the problems you have in terms of your collective OT cybersecurity needs. And so this is why we really speak to this as a 1 + 1 = 3, kind of represented in this chart.
Thanks so much, Shannon. Appreciate that. I'm going to then build off of what Shannon talked about in diving into a couple of use cases where we're bringing together these two pieces to help improve our clients' overall security. So I'm going to start with vulnerability management. This is a topic that is absolutely critical in every security program. And so we, as Verve, walk in the door with a really deep view of asset management, asset inventory, right? So the way our software works is, instead of relying on information through a switch as to what might be in the environment, we literally go out and find assets, right? And the way we can do that is we're communicating, using the native protocols of those devices. So there's no risk to doing this, and we've been doing it for 20 years. And it's all built on that heritage of being a vendor agnostic system integrator as well. So getting that really deep view of the risks, the assets first, and then therefore the risks and the vulnerabilities. We then combine that with information that Rockwell has about its assets, such as end-of-life data, software compatibility and firmware compatibility. So if you're going to update one piece of software, what about the other software on your connected devices? Warranty information on those assets that may not be security related per se, but we know that there is an operational potential risk on a device. And so, okay, should we be addressing that? Next, Rockwell Asset Center, right? So Verve is providing out of the box today, before we came with Rockwell, a whole way of identifying changes in the OT environment, right? Changes to the configurations on Windows devices, changes in user behavior, et cetera. But now bringing in all the Rockwell Asset Center information around changes to the ladder logic of a PLC, et cetera. We are today already deploying patches on OS devices, Windows patches, applications, et cetera. But now, combined with Rockwell and their capabilities through what they're building around Control Flash Plus and being able to update firmware, we can now go to that next step, right? And not just be applying patches to Windows and networking gear, but also to firmware on PLCs and other things. We talked about 360 risk score. I'm going to dive into that a little bit more here in a second, so I'll hold on that. As Shannon mentioned, right, a global team, hundreds of OT security practitioners on the Rockwell team that can help clients remediate. It can help them do network segmentation, that can help them deploy other tools, backup tools, for instance, or antivirus tools, et cetera. And then lastly, a global team of monitoring, right? So we have a global SOC. We have 16 or 17 different monitoring centers around the world. So the ability to provide that MSSP-like capabilities, but with a specific OT capability. As I mentioned, this risk scoring, I want to do a bit of a deep dive in here because we think this is a critical element to that whole idea of efficiency and prioritization. So I mentioned before that 360 view. This is kind of how that works within the Verve platform today. We'll take an asset type, we'll identify the asset type, we'll then identify its criticality. Sometimes that's actually clients already have that information through their disaster recovery or other types of programs, which we'll just integrate and bring into Verve. We then add in the risk components, right? So when you think about a risk score, you have to add the criticality of the asset, plus how at risk is it from vulnerabilities, from users and accounts that aren't managed, from configuration insecurities, et cetera. And that builds us basically what we call an unmitigated risk score, right? And we can actually do that at an asset level, at a plant level, et cetera. But then you may have some compensating controls already in place, or you may start to add them over time. I segmented the network. I put a firewall in front of it. I hardened a set of configuration settings. I patched certain elements. And so as those compensating or mitigating controls come in place, that risk score will change, right? And so in real time, we'll see, okay, how do we move from red to green, so to speak, on that risk score? And so this information that we have, and the richer that information can be, the richer our risk scores can be. And now bringing what Verve already had in terms of information and adding to it what Rockwell has really, takes us to the next level in terms of our ability to prioritize risk. I'm going to highlight here, Shannon mentioned two other names that some of you on the call may not know well. So Avnet and Oylo. So over the last 4 years, Rockwell's made a series of acquisitions in the cybersecurity space to add depth and expertise into their team. The first is Avnet, which is an Israeli-based company that is 30 years of experience doing deep cybersecurity research, both for the Israeli government as well as other organizations around the world. It is a world-class set of cybersecurity experts. That team, along with the Oylo team, which was originally based in Europe and Latin America, which is a really expert OT networks cybersecurity team, right? So they've been deploying threat detection tools, network threat detection tools, network designs, et cetera. Those two teams combined with Verve, combined with the Rockwell, give us a level of cybersecurity expertise that I think is really tough to touch within the OT security space, and allows us to do things like this, to really lay out a roadmap, a comprehensive roadmap of what are the things that you need to do at kind of maturity level 1, maturity level 2, across the domains, right? Whether it be endpoint security like patching, et cetera, access control, whether it be remote access, et cetera, network management. So yes, so we got to have, we want to redesign the network to segment it, remove dual NICs, or eventually putting in, network threat detection. And then lastly, the policies and procedures, right? So that, when we were independent as Verve, we didn't really offer a policy and procedure capability. Well, Avnet is literally best in class at building these policies and procedures. And when you integrate that with what Rockwell knows about the OT environment, and adapting those specifically to that, it really allows us to provide a roadmap that's truly comprehensive around a program. The next use case I'm going to highlight is detection and response. So if we think about the NIST framework, detect is a major portion of that. Well, in the IT world, that's moved, from EDR, endpoint detection and response, to something called XDR, and there's another new name for it every week. But the point here is the whole concept of the capability is, how do we get a lot of telemetry into a data set that I can then analyze together to drive better insights about what's really a threat and how do I deal with it? And so what Rockwell brings, so Verve had a variety of things we were already doing around threat detection, but Rockwell has an entire managed SOC capability where they're doing threat hunting and building new rule-based detections. They're helping clients on alerts to respond to those alerts. And so now, through what Verve has to offer, what Rockwell has in-house, and what Rockwell has partnerships for, things on that DPI NIDS, and so that's things like Clarity and Dragos and that sort of thing. We can now pull all of this data together into Verve, right? So, and we integrate with a Clarity, with a Dragos, with a Cisco, et cetera. We can bring that data in and then feed that into Rockwell's managed SOC. So a client can now have real insight about what are the alerts, what are the threats that are happening, not just a bunch of alerts, but intelligent information about threats. And what we like to call least disruptive response. So taking all of that risk data into that SOC analysis team and saying, okay, if it's let's say it's a pass the hash attack that we see happening, which account appears to be compromised? And then we can immediately go and find every computer where that account exists. And we can actually take the next step if we'd like to, and we can disable that account. And so we can, I'm just using that as an example, but the point here is, because we have all this endpoint data, we have all the user and account data, we have the behavior data, we can find what is the least disruptive thing we could do to stop that particular attack. And not only that, we can then integrate that with actions. As I mentioned before, Verve has an ability to patch things. Well, we can also, remove a user if necessary. We can, shut down a piece of software. You can stop a process. So it allows the SOC team, if a client would like us to not only identify the risk, but potentially go and stop the threat in its tracks. This capability, we think, is we don't see another firm that can offer this comprehensive thing, and it is such a huge need for our clients to reduce that alert fatigue and focus on the most important alerts and what I can actually do about that. Last case study I'm going to talk about is the resource challenge. So as Shannon mentioned before, resources is the #1 problem. Part of this can be addressed with software, right? So the Verve software has been designed to specifically improve the efficiency of how do you do OT cyber, right? It's all about how do I focus and prioritize the risks so I know what I can go do, and then how do I streamline the execution of those remediations. So software is a part of this, but we need people, right? At the end of the day, security needs people. So this is data from NIST's CyberSeek database. So NIST maintains a database of all open cybersecurity jobs. And then they break those jobs down by function. And what's really telling about this analysis is how many of the open jobs in cybersecurity, and this is, by the way, IT and OT, how many of those jobs are in what would be referred to as systems management. Things like architecture, new device provisioning, patch management, configuration management, etc. That, as we think about what we're going to try and offer to our clients from a services point of view, that's kind of core to what Rockwell has been about, and frankly, what Verve has been about for a long time. That 75–80% of the tasks are key. And then in addition, with Rockwell's capabilities around their managed services and their managed SOC, right? The ability to do that next level down, right? Analyze threats in a SOC, respond to those threats, collect data, and help a client deal with those threats. So what we've done then is we've built this turnkey solutions combining Rockwell's hundreds of people in the field plus these 16 global remote centers where they're monitoring, combining that together into a true turnkey set of solutions on the services side to help our clients with that resource problem, right? At the end of the day, we don't have enough bodies to do this that are really skilled. And so some of the things around, global SOC services, global network segmentation, the ability to do global assessments across plants, 300 plants all over the world, but we've got resources to go do that. Global remediation tool deployment, right? So the ability to deploy a standard toolkit, whether you're in, Chicago or you're in Riyadh or you're in Rio. And then global patch review, prioritization, et cetera, a whole range of services that will wrap around, that we can wrap around that software. And what's the goal of all this? The goal is to reduce the cost. And we've proven this. We've seen this in action, right? The assessment cost differences between using a tech-enabled approach like we do, or a traditional, surveys, go visit the sites, et cetera. It's about a 50% savings. And then as you think about then remediating and maintaining that, the ability to use technology to do that and prioritize what you're remediating and do that maintenance centrally through a central management tool, that saves about 70% of the total cost. So cost is important here, but at the end of the day, it's all about improving security. So another kind of real world example of, if you deploy this kind of solution, you can basically double the security maturity over about a year to 18 months of program. And so our whole goal in this is by applying that Verve software and services, combining that with Rockwell, is to improve this even more, right? And to continue to drive down costs for our clients while improving their security. So in summary, we think there's really 5 benefits that we're going to be able to bring together. So #1 is that better asset visibility and risk management. So a more complete view of all of your assets, deep into the networks and the risk on those, combining that with the information from the Rockwell sources too. Second, this integrated platform. So by bringing all that data together, it allows me to do targeted response and lowers my cost of doing it. Third, comprehensive protection. So not just, okay, I've got visibility, I know there's an anomaly, but I can actually go fix it, whether that be through an automated action in the software or resources to help. Accelerated and targeted response. I talked about this least disruptive response point before, being able to really narrow down to what is the specific risk and how do I attack that specific risk, rather than just shut down the plant. And then lastly, a set of resources to help clients globally, whether that be assessment, whether that be network segmentation, remediation, et cetera. And then obviously the managed security services. So we think this combination of things will help significantly improve the cost and security of our clients. So with that, I'll draw us to an end here. I'm happy to answer questions. I think there's a couple in the chat here. So one of the questions is, are you a consulting firm or provide the security network services like an MSSP? So the whole, and maybe we've answered that as we've talked here, but our goal is to provide a turnkey solution, one throat to choke, whatever you want to talk about. So up front, we're going to have a services capability combined with software to allow you to do that tech-enabled assessment, right? Really use technology to get in and get the data you need, but have that intelligence from people from Avnet and Oilo and Verve to really help you identify what's the right roadmap. Then use the technology to continue to monitor that risk, but then have an ongoing managed service capability to monitor your risk and your security over time. How do we see PKI and certificate lifecycle management? I think that's it's a topic that our CTO and I have been talking a lot about, of how are we going to bring in that certificate. Our view is that becomes another one of these integrations, like we talk about EOL type information, et cetera. We'll be able to maintain, if customer would like, that certificate lifecycle information in the same place. And so therefore, we can monitor those. We can identify when they are running out, and we might be able to even update them through the platform itself. There were a couple of, maybe one more. There were, how about working with other vendors? So great question. And I would go back. I'm going to just zip back to this page here. Where was it? See if I can find it. Nope, up here. I got to find it again. All right. This one. So one of the key parts of the Rockwell mission is to integrate with partners. And I'll say Verve and Rockwell together both believe this. You can't do this with one tool. You can't do this with one service provider. You need to think about, how do we integrate this? And so when we say one-stop shop, we don't mean, and one-throat shop, we don't mean that we're doing it all. What we mean is we are going to try and quarterback that and bring those other technologies into a central management console. So, the partnerships that Rockwell has with Clarity and Dragos and Cisco and others on the threat detection side, and that we have had with ServiceNow or with Acronis, that Rockwell has with with CrowdStrike, and we've had with Carbon Black. All of those are absolutely critical. You can't do this if all we said was, yeah, Verve is going to solve all your problems forever. No, it won't. You need other components. What we're trying to say when we say turnkey is, but you need to have some central core that allows those pieces to integrate into, that allows you to manage it in a simple way, so you're not managing 12 tools, right? And then you need, we believe, a team of people that can help address the services parts of those things. Now, Rockwell has great partnerships, and Shannon can talk about that with system integrators, et cetera. We will definitely be working closely with them because they know those clients' environments in Shannon, you may want to comment a little bit on that piece.
No, I think you hit it, John. I don't know that I can expand much more on that, but I agree. I mean, this is a work in process as we get to, we're only 100 days into this, but we've already learned a ton. And I think there's an opportunity there for sure into the future on the integrator side. John, there's two questions in there that seem kind of related, and I'll just maybe ask you of them, as you're probably looking at them as well. Numerous companies still running legacy PLC hardware on device net or control net. And so the question is, does Verve's technology have the ability to traverse device net and control net bridges to the end devices? And then there's a secondary question around managing serial devices, which is kind of similar, but any comments there?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can do some of that today, and we realize the control net and a variety of other essentially serial type networks are out there, and we have a variety of those. I'll call them drivers because we talk to them about them as drivers today, and we're continuing to expand that. Obviously, our relationship with Rockwell will only accelerate that, but yes, we recognize that's a key part of the whole puzzle. In terms of just one last point, in terms of managing them, I probably want to be careful there. There's nothing today that we're doing to quote unquote manage those serial devices, meaning push updates to them or anything like that. This is more identifying them, identifying the risks in them, and report rather than quote unquote. We think when we say manage, we mean actually be able to change them in some way, to update them, etc.
It's all for the key questions
yes,
that have come in.
Yeah, thank you. Well, good. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We're going to have another one of these in March, as we normally do. We're still working through exactly what the topic is. We have a lot more content now that we're part of Rockwell. So, but thank you all for joining us today. And if you have any questions, I think on the last page, I had our email addresses here. So to the extent you need to reach us, please do feel free to reach out to myself or to Shannon. So again, thank you for your attendance today, and look forward to our next webinar.